Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Paul Kincaid, Director of Congressional Outreach for FMC, the Association of Former Members of Congress. Thank you for joining us today for this discussion entitled Diplomats in the United States Congress Working Together to Promote International Understanding. This event is being held in cooperation with our Diplomatic Advisory Council members, as well as our friends and partners at the Executive Council on Diplomacy, and it's an interactive discussion. If you have questions at any time, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, fill out your name and your question, and if we choose you, our moderator will call on you to ask your question over audio only to our panel. Again, anytime during the call, just click the Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. We have a wonderful discussion planned for this morning and a great moderator to help guide it. Nancy Zushin-Schlegel, Vice President of International Government Affairs for Lockheed Martin, has more than 30 years of experience in international trade, global defense and aerospace, and political advocacy. Nancy joined Lockheed in 1992, and she's been a great supporter of FMC throughout the years, including her service now as a member of FMC's Advisory Council. We thank her for her commitment to FMC and for being gracious enough to join us this morning. She'll introduce our two great congressional panelists. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this first joint event hosted by FMC and the Executive Council on Diplomacy. As Paul said, I serve on the Corporate Advisory Council for FMC and as the chairman of the Executive Council on Diplomacy. These are two terrific organizations who collectively work to promote civic and cultural education, training, and networking, relationship building among their membership. FMC was founded in 1980 to serve current and former members of Congress to promote collaborative problem solving and civic education. And that's why we are so pleased to have a bipartisan line of speakers this morning. The Executive Council on Diplomacy was formed almost 55 years ago to support the U.S. and foreign diplomatic corps with cultural and civic education, training, and public-private partnerships. The discussion here today really falls in a sweet spot for me as a recovering lobbyist, now responsible for Lockheed Martin's diplomatic outreach. I'm really excited for the conversation with our two speakers. Before we begin, I'd like to also recognize another common thread through FMC and ECD, and that is His Excellency Ashok Kumar Mirpuri, the Singapore's ambassador to the United States, who is also the chairman of the Ambassadors Advisory Council for the Executive Council on Diplomacy and sits on the Diplomatic Advisory Council for FMC. So welcome. As we turn to our discussion, I'll be posing a couple of questions to our speakers and go through 3 or 4 questions before we turn to Ambassador Mirpuri for comments and then open it up to questions. Now, discussion today. It seems that we are living in a world of unprecedented global challenges, threats to our safety, our health, our economies, and our communities. Relationships are being tested among our families, among our communities, and across our borders. The role of the diplomat and the elected official both are to represent the interests of their countries, their communities, their regions, their states. They build on relationships, seek to understand perspectives, foster collaboration where feasible, and stand firm on principles. Build consensus around shared problems, and build trust for meaningful solutions. This is not easy, especially in these stressful times. That's why we are honored to have two speakers who are going to share some of their unique perspective and experience with us. Two current members of Congress who were former members of the U.S. Diplomatic Corps. Former ambassadors and Congressman Don Beyer, Democrat from Virginia, and Congressman Francis Rooney, a Republican from Florida. Welcome, Congressman. Congressman Beyer represents the Northern Virginia suburbs surrounding Washington, D.C., and I dare say many of us on the call this morning. He currently serves on the Ways and Means Committee and on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Congressman Beyer previously served as ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein under President Obama. And Ambassador Rooney represents the 19th District of Southwest Florida. He serves as the ranking member on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He previously served as ambassador to the Holy See from 2005 to 2008 under President George W. Bush. Ambassadors, congressmen, welcome. I'm going to turn to Representative Beyer for the first question. Congressman Beyer, what do you think you learned from your role at representing the United States abroad as ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and how has that experience shaped your role as a legislator in the U.S. Congress?
Well, Nancy, first of all, thank you so much for moderating this. And it's a thrill to be on with my friend, Francis Rooney. When I hear about how much people in Washington hate each other, I think that's not true at all. Many of us are very good friends. And Francis and I have the distinction of, we each served ambassador to the only two countries with square flags, the Vatican and Switzerland. And we're both graduates of the two Jesuit high schools in Greater Washington, D.C., Gonzaga and Georgetown Prep. So we share much in common, even though I'm a lot older than Francis. But I learned so much there. In fact, my favorite Kiwanis Rotary speech is the 25 things I learned in Switzerland. But in terms of its direct relevance to service in the US Congress, a lot of it is just understanding how different societies, different governments, with often different values, or at least different processes, can work very well. It's not quite fair to compare an 8 million person country like Switzerland with the vast world power of the United States, but just if I take the number one thing I learned from Switzerland is that they govern by what they call shared power, concordance in Germany, where they meet secretly, which we can't do in the United States, and they work things out, and then they come out, and all across the political spectrum, from the Social Democrats to the Swiss People's Party, they say, here's what we agreed, and we're all on board and move forward. So they looked at us and said, you guys swing from left to right, the left back again. We just move slowly forward together. I thought about running on a shared power platform, but all the political consultants said that wouldn't exactly work. But it's really fun when people in Congress say, we're uniquely American exceptionalism. It's important to realize that as wonderful as we are, this is not the only way to do it and be successful. And we can learn from other countries too.
Thank you. Ambassador Rooney, what about you? What did you learn? And what do you wish you had known before you arrived in country for your posting? Oh, you're on mute.
How about that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
You know what they say, technology is anything that wasn't invented when you were born. Nancy, thank you for moderating this, and Congressman Beyer, thank you for being on it and for being the great leader you are. One of the bright spots in my 4 years has been working with Don Beyer. He represents that collaborative problem solving, which very few members do, and he represents it in spades. And it's a great honor to be your friend and customer of Volvo's, and to work with you, and look forward to continuing to do it as I join the former members of Congress gleefully here in January. I learned so many things, as Congressman Beyer mentioned, a deeper understanding of the process of diplomacy. I'd done a fair bit of that work for George Bush over the 8 years or 6 years prior to going to Rome. And the ability of diplomats to bridge different ideas, to diffuse conflict when possible, is a very meritorious service. And I think sometimes people don't really realize how diplomacy can work to move the ball forward in the world. I mean, I admired President Obama's effort to do the Cuba thing, and the Holy See played a uniquely secretive role in accomplishing that for him. The other thing I learned about is how little some people know about the United States. In my post, we spoke a lot about the First Amendment and religious freedom and citizenship. And I was very much involved in Bush's effort to get immigration reform accomplished with Senator Kennedy and Senator McCain. The people in Italy have no concept of our national earned citizenship. In Italy, if you're not born an Italian, you're never going to be an Italian. And it was very strange for me to learn that. And I had a lot of roundtables trying to explain to people what America is really all about.
All right, that mute button is, I think, the nemesis of all of us these days. Thank you, Congressman Rooney. So let me stick with you, and you're both raising really thoughtful ideas about the importance of cultural understanding and communication. So as we think about the unique role that the Foreign Diplomatic Corps play in Washington, what is the best way to encourage dialogue? First of all, is it important for members of Congress and the Diplomatic Corps to know each other, to communicate and to engage?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the most unfortunate consequences of the 80s was the lack of members engaging with each other socially and living in Washington, D.C. Metropolitan area. I think that this business of everybody getting into a fever pitch come 11 o'clock Friday to fly home and coming back at 6 o'clock Monday night has really disrupted the ability to build collegiality and understanding and appreciation of other people's points of view.
So, and Congressman Beyer, what do you think is the best way for diplomats and members of Congress to communicate? Are there ideas how we can facilitate that? What type of programming works, both within this COVID environment where in person is really difficult for anyone, but then when we get to the new normal, hopefully post-COVID, what do you look forward to seeing and engaging in with members of the diplomatic community here?
Outside the COVID world, which changes all of our lives, the two most obvious are the visits of the ambassadors to the various congressional offices. I've met with many over my last 6 years. I'm sure Francis has also. And it is really helpful to understand from the ambassador's perspective what's going on back in wherever, Armenia or Switzerland or Singapore or the like. But the social thing can't be understated either. Those dinner parties, when you sit next to somebody and talk for an hour or two about the kids and their culture and the conflicts and their hopes, is really a wonderful way to do it. But then the third way, and it was easier probably for Francis and for me because our countries were small, but getting out, I found that the best way for me to connect with the Swiss parliamentarians was to go to their districts and tour their district with them. And because then it's your friends for life and you really understand what they're putting up with, and it's easier for them to understand who you are.
Indeed, indeed. So congressional visits around the world and getting diplomats into U.S. communities to see how U.S. Voters and elected officials are operating and really what they care about, what they worry about and what they care about. Which brings me to my next question. And that is, what are the international issues that you think are most concerning to members of Congress these days? And what issues do you wish Congress had the time to focus on more? I'll start with Congressman Beyer.
Do I get an hour to answer that?
I was just thinking that.
I don't even know where to start. I mean, it seems to me that, and you know, I'm a Biden person, obviously, as a Democrat. I'm looking forward to trying to really strengthen our friendships, partnerships, especially with Europe and Western Europe, but everywhere in the globe. The America first, America alone. And I don't mean this to be a critical thing, but I do feel critically about it, that I think I want to re-engage with the world and not be so much pushing people around as engaging with them to solve the many huge problems that we have. And we can go through everything from climate change to arms control, to extreme weather events, to the problems with immigration everywhere. And there's so much religious conflict, on and on and on. But I think we only solve those by working together.
Ambassador Rooney?
Yeah. Do you mean should or are? I think we mean should here. Should be dealing with, because there's so many things, as Congressman Beyer mentioned, that need to be worked on. And I'm hopeful that this short spate of regional nativism, as George Bush used to call it, the isms, nativism, individualism, parochialism, is a temporary blurb in what has basically been, ever since World War I, an effort to bring the world together and to create architectures which can resolve global problems. And just when we need help around the world, more than ever, for all the things you mentioned, Nancy, we don't have it because we poisoned the well with a lot of our allies. And we can rebuild that. Then we'll rebuild it quick. I don't find a lot of differences between Vice President Biden's view of foreign policy and President George W. Bush's. And I think they were built on multilateralism.
Do you think international issues resonate with voters? Do you find you have to make an extra effort to communicate and explain the relative importance of international issues to U.S. voters?
You want me to answer that one?
Yeah,
I'm sure it's a little different for Don being in the metropolitan area here in Alexandria, but for us, if I walked down the street in Fort Myers and asked 40 people where Belarus was, I bet none of them would know. And that's the problem with foreign policy, is that it doesn't ring a lot of bells around the country. And then when someone wants to demean our diplomatic work and undermine relationships, it's pretty easy for them to do it. I know some very educated people that can't name all the countries in South America.
Yeah, I think that is the tough one. The challenge, I think, for internationalists is you don't recognize the value of all the good work that's happening every single day, but you certainly recognize the problem when things go bad. And so having a strong diplomatic international outreach is almost like oxygen. You take it for granted when it's working, when you've got it. When it's not working well, you sure feel it, and it's a problem.
That's a good point. It's kind of like the intelligence business. When things work well, nobody knows.
Right. So let me turn back to Congressman Beyer. We've talked about getting to know communities and travel and exchanges. Do you have any other ideas for how we can better work to educate voters and legislatures about global affairs? How can we help you?
Nancy, I'm particularly concerned to pick up on my pal Ambassador Rooney's comments about people not knowing where Belarus is. It seems to me that from an educational standpoint in the US, we need to make a much greater commitment to history and to civics. I ran statewide in Virginia 3 times. I was always amazed at the Virginia counties where half of the people had never left the county and many of them never left the state. When you travel the world, when you have the resources to travel the world, by the way, the imagination and the money, to see how the rest of the world is unfolding, I think it makes you much more enlightened about the public policies that can work in the United States, and much more understanding. You know, crashing out that world perspective. And I would, by the way, that one of the things that really helped in Switzerland is how many of those folks had come and spent part of their high school years or college years in the U.S. And so they loved us because they knew us. But if we could have the American citizens go spend a year in France or a year in Paraguay or a year in China, that would help them too. And our government.
I think that's so important. You know, speaking from the defense and aerospace industry, we know that the relationships built from young officers training together, coming to the United States, learning our system, appreciating our values, getting to know the families, those relationships endure and are extremely critical as nations grow and as history evolves. So I think making sure that we have the ability to promote continued exchanges, educational exchanges, training is very, very worthwhile in my perspective.
Nancy, just to pile on, the Americans, we are good people. We are friendly, we are generous, and you don't always get that in the international headlines. But when they come and they live with us, it changes their perspective completely.
Understand our values.
I think two of the most important investments that the State Department makes is that exchange program where they bring people over. And I'm sure you had a lot of your Swiss colleagues over there attend those, as well as like the Eisenhower Fellows program where they bring foreign people here and Americans get to go abroad.
Mm-hmm. Let's say you're on mute, Ambassador Congressman Beyer.
Just nodding in agreement to Francis.
Great. I'm violently nodding. My very first job was with People to People International, where we took groups of American experts and all over the world to meet with their counterparts and share ideas and look at collaborative problem solving. So I definitely appreciate both of you having that frame of mind and respect for our international friends and colleagues around the world. At this point, I am going to open it to, let's see, do we have Ambassador Mirpuri on the line? Not yet. Okay, let's open it up to questions from the audience. All right, let's talk
Nancy,
about.
while you're looking for that, I'd say that one of the advantages of having been a diplomat representing the U.S. was, you know, how incredibly important it is to listen to the other person's perspective. I found Ambassador Rooney among the most wonderful people to work with in the U.S. Congress, despite the fact they're on opposite sides of the aisle. And I have my list of, I'm trying to get to 100 Republican friends. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying because the good legislation is all stuff that we do together.
Yeah. That's great. That's great.
Yeah, a lot of the people in the Congress wouldn't exactly say which aisle I'm on right now.
If you have questions, please hit your Q&A button among our listeners. And we have Ambassador Mirpuri on the line. Let's see if we can pull him up.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good, thank you. I've been on the line throughout, but I was on a different link, I suspect. So,
Okay.
Congressman Rooney, Congressman Beyer, this has been a fascinating discussion. Very nice to have both of you on this call. And Nancy, thank you for moderating this and really bringing together the world of diplomacy with the world of Congress, which both Representative Rooney and Beyer do represent, which is a very unique vantage point that you have in Congress, having served as diplomats overseas, as ambassadors overseas, and then sitting here representing your districts. And as a general comment, you know, sort of, I think that is the biggest challenge many of us, even in the world of diplomacy, professional diplomacy, face, is how do we connect the world of diplomacy with local politics? And I think both of you have done that very well. It is very important because until we get people on the ground to understand what we are trying to achieve, whether it is through trade agreements, whether it is through other sorts of projects, we will never have full support for everything we do. I think that has emerged as one big challenge that we face. And as an additional comment, I think one of the most useful things I have done in my 8 years here in Washington, D.C., is visit members of Congress and their districts. Because in many ways, that makes it real for the people in the districts and the members of Congress as well to sort of do little town halls with diplomats, with ambassadors. And I hope that when we get back to be able to traveling after these times of COVID, that more of that can be done by you and your colleagues, because I think that really also connects the international world with the local world. I do have a question for both of you gentlemen. And in many ways, both of you served as US ambassadors overseas. US ambassador has a very exalted place overseas. Wherever you go, there's a red carpet out for you. Whether you're visiting the Pope in the Holy See, you have all the Swiss guards over there standing at attention as you come in. And Congressman Beyer, when you go to see the Swiss president, it's very different for ambassadors from small countries. You know, as a Singapore ambassador, many other ambassadors on this call who represent smaller countries. We're not global powers. And it is sometimes difficult in a capital like Washington, D.C., to make ourselves heard and seen. And so I wanted to get from you some advice on what do ambassadors of smaller states do in order to be able to get some attention in Washington, D.C., particularly in Congress. And I say this because Singapore in particular, we've tried to take the lead to organize smaller states to offer a voice to the global community. We lead something called the Forum of Small States in the United Nations, where we lead something called the 3G Group, which offers advice to the G20, even though we're smaller countries. And today we're working with countries like Switzerland around international vaccines, creating a Friends of the Facility to make some of these things going. But as representatives of small states, as we come to Washington, D.C., how can we make our voices better heard, and how do we partner with you in Congress? Thank you very much.
Francis, do you want to go?
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm kind of, I can understand that point, having been at the Holy See, which is probably the smallest place that you can be ambassador to, since Andorra is part of Spain. But you know, several ambassadors here have struck me as being extraordinarily effective in accomplishing the things that you're raising, Ambassador. The lady that, I forget her name, that's with Jordan and the Qataris, do a lot of outreach with members, both socially and panels and things like that. And of course, she's got a pretty potent weapon with King Abdullah coming over all the time and meeting with our committee. And she leverages that quite well. I know during the NAFTA stuff, John Delaney, another great Democrat friend of mine, and I held a series of dinner parties bipartisan dinner parties with the Mexican ambassador to talk about NAFTA and try to defang some of the hysteria that was being put out largely by my team about how bad it was. And I think it did some good. It got a lot of votes.
Yeah, I agree with Francis to the extent that you can do it socially. This gets back to Ambassador Rooney's earlier point about flying in Monday at 6:30 and bailing out at 1 o'clock on Thursday. That back pre-Newt Gingrich, when members of Congress moved their families here, there was a lot more opportunity for that. But you look at Dina, for example, from Jordan, or the folks from Liechtenstein, they've done a lot of socializing and had a lot of members of Congress over and know them well. Claudia Fritchie represented Liechtenstein for 10 years here. I think she knew every member of Congress.
Yeah.
And that may be part of it too, is staying long enough to make those relationships. If it's a 3 or 4 year turnover, at the time you get to really know people, you have to go back.
Yeah, I would say Colombia's had some pretty good representation like that too, Don. They've had 3 ambassadors since I've been here, probably more than what you, but they do a lot of dinners. They do a lot of panel discussions. They have a lot of foreign ministers come in and They invite the Western Hemisphere people to have a lot of interaction with them. And I would particularly single out, I don't know if you got to know Ambassador Espina from Guatemala. There for a while, he was in my office so often I thought I might have to charge him rent. But he was very effective in making sure that we knew how Guatemala was trying to be better, even though the press didn't give them any breaks at all.
And I also do think too, that going out, getting out of Washington helps. If you can go to La Crosse, Wisconsin and do a town hall meeting with Representative Ron Kind, first of all, he'll remember you forever and vice versa. And the people in La Crosse will learn a whole lot more about Singapore than they knew before.
You know, when I was in the Holy See, the ambassador from Austria had been in the United States before he came to the Holy See. He went to every state in the country and met with every governor while he was ambassador.
That's,
Yeah, I visited all 26 cantons, and that was the most press I got while I was in Switzerland.
Well, I did not
People think
visit every
visiting.
church, that's for sure.
that would have been tough. Yeah, that is an interesting additional angle here, the diplomatic outreach to the governors and the programming that we're starting to see with the National Governors Association and others, but also individual states, the economic development agencies in individual states having a very robust trade mission. I've run into governors' offices all around the world, and I think that's an important part of both showing who we are, but also kind of sharing ideas for how we can work better together to promote bilateral investment. So we have another common thread through FMC and the Executive Council on Diplomacy, and that is Ambassador Connie Morella, who has a terrific history of starting as a member of Congress and serving as U.S. Ambassador to the OECD. Ambassador Morella, if you are on the
Sure.
line with an open mic, welcome.
Thank you. I want to thank the Congress members for being here during this very challenging time. And I love the stories. Nancy, thank you for your leadership. But having been ambassador to OECD and been a member of Congress prior to that, I found there was a distinction between being my own independent voice, representing my state and my constituents, and being the voice that represented our government executive branch. I had to kind of modify and do my lobbying according to where, who I represented. Did you find that to be a little challenging, and how did you handle it? I know you handle it also by getting to know the people involved, knowing what they want, trying to fashion our government to be applicable to their feelings. And then, of course, as a member of Congress, you want to represent your constituents, and you may have a different view that you want to express. So any comments you have, I'd appreciate.
Don, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, first of all, Connie, we loved it when you represented Montgomery County in suburban Maryland. And I was heartbroken when you left till I realized you got to move right to Paris. Which seemed like a pretty good gig. I thought the hardest part was getting there and realizing after sort of a lifetime. Francis and I were both business people too, so we come with that perspective of being my own boss and speaking my own mind and realizing that ambassador means messenger. Their Botschaft in German is message, and so I was frustrated by the fact that I would have to do what the desk officer half my age back in Maine State was telling me to do. So in that sense, being a member of Congress is much more fun and more fulfilling in the sense of being a change agent, of picking up the paper and saying, that's wrong and I'm going to go do something about it, which you can't really do as an ambassador.
Well, I would probably have a little different slant. I had it pretty good because I was very close to George Bush and the people that were his key people, Andy Card and so Steve Hadley. So whenever the State Department would try to cuff me around, I could just call the White House, and they usually let me do what I wanted. And that gave me a little bit more freedom than a lot of my colleagues at the time. Even to the point of one time writing an op-ed against Cuba and with the ambassador to Spain. And the State Department really got mad, but it was important to do it, and the Bush White House liked it. So I thought the diplomatic work was really quite rewarding. I didn't have any difficulty with George W.'s globalist agenda or his effort to reform immigration and to improve education, which are pretty much bipartisan things. I've been a little frustrated with the Congress. Maybe it's because of the position that I'm in over there on the other side of the aisle, but we just seem to be the people of no, and we can't seem to do any of that constructive problem solving that Nancy mentioned.
Thank you. We have a couple of other questions teed up. Let's take a question from the ambassador from the Philippines, followed by a question from former U.S. Ambassador Tom Pickering. Okay, so the ambassador from the Philippines.
Hello. Hi. Yes, this is Ambassador Maldes from the Philippines. Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you to Congressman Rooney and Congressman Beyer. I just wanted to, it's just an observation that old allies like the Philippines sometimes feel that we're taken for granted by the United States. And how do you suggest that we try to remove this kind of impression sometimes so that our relationship can continue to be as strong as it's always been?
Well, you're not the only one being ignored by the United States right now. You've got some pretty good partners in that unfortunate circumstance. But, I think that when some of the preceding presidents have had a lot more profile relationship with both President Obama and President Bush anyway. So, maybe this particular time of chemistry is not as optimum for the Philippines as some times in the past have been.
And all of life is relationship. So as close as you can get to the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines and to the folks like Congressman Rooney on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I would even think, the assistant secretaries and the deputy assistant secretaries at state responsible for your area of the world. Those are really important relationships.
Thank you. Ambassador Pickering, are you up?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks very much. Francis, it's good to see you again. And Don, I buy a Subaru from you regularly. So,
Thank you, Ambassador.
look, we've seen a rough go in the last 4 years in personnel in the State Department, many of them Foreign Service, but not exclusively. A number of us are contemplating the idea of reforming and trying to use the Congress as an informed and indeed allied partner in doing this and taking a look at what might be done with the Foreign Service Act of 1980 to accomplish that purpose, and hopefully to enlist the support of the Secretary, and this without which it will not happen. But what else do we need to think about in the wisdom you both have and worked across the lines, you're members of Congress and you've both been ambassadors, to bring on board Congress people to support that objective? What kinds of approaches, techniques, tactics, relationship building should we think about?
Tom, great to hear your voice. It's been a while since we visited. I miss those CSPC days and all that, but get back to that maybe next. I thought some of the reforms that Rex wanted to put in place conceptually might make some sense. The geographic organization overlaid with the bureaus, but obviously the way he went about it was horrible. And there might be some opportunities for people from within the department, like you, to take some of the good ideas that were in that and harness them in a productive manner. That's kind of what Ambassador McKinley testified about when he did his testimony about the Burisma business. And that might be one thing that would help.
Yeah, and Ambassador, I'm the only certified auto mechanic in Congress. So if you need any help on that Subaru, just give me a call. But also, I would love to see us really re-emphasize and rebuild the Foreign Service. I came away from my 4 years with so many friends, lifelong friends from the career Foreign Service officers that I just really admired. And, reportedly has taken quite a hit the last couple of years. So the notion that we recruit and respect and we lift up and we make the Foreign Service one of those things that so many of our young people should aspire to, representing our country overseas. It's an amazing lifestyle, good for your kids, and I'd love to see us with where we're well, part of it too is the old notion when you ask the typical American how much of our federal budget is spent on overseas, and you get 25% when it's actually way less than 1%. Is continuing to fight that back and push for ever more investment in the world, because that's how we project American values, American power, American culture.
If I might build on that, I think Congressman Beyer hit the nail on the head. Somehow or another, we've got to get through this rough patch that we're in of ignoring the world and depreciating the value of the State Department and the Foreign Service, and get back to more historic normality in the way the diplomatic corps does its work. Like the business we went through, Tom, on the USIP. I was the only Republican to vote to keep the USIP funded, as well as and opposed all the State Department cuts, and work with people like Don there to make sure that that they didn't put it out of business.
That's so important, and looking at how we can grow additional congressional support for understanding the value of U.S. diplomacy and the infrastructure necessary to support our diplomats overseas. I know, speaking from the business perspective, we are not successful unless we have the full advocacy, help, and support from our embassies and missions around the world. So we've seen it makes a difference, and we encourage continued support there. And thank you for your leadership. We have a question from Professor Alan Tidwell from Georgetown University. Professor Tidwell, go ahead and ask your question. You unmute.
Hi, thanks very much. Sorry about that. Gentlemen, thank you very much for the presentation. It's been very interesting and I've enjoyed it very much. And as a former employee of USIP, I appreciate your vote. Thank you very much. But I'm curious, I've talked to a couple of members of the House in years past and have heard them bemoan the level of understanding, of deep understanding of the international environment. That there are gentlemen and women on the Hill who have a great understanding of the international environment, but there are others whose understanding of the international is pretty weak. And I was wondering, do you have any thoughts or insights on how we can better promote a deeper understanding and appreciation of the international environment for members of the House and the Senate as well? So I'll go ahead and mute and just take your question, take your answer. Thanks.
Well, I would say there's a couple of things that I think. First of all, term limits, and second of all, campaign finance reform. Because as long as the members are so exclusively focused on keeping their job and not getting crosswise with anybody that can hurt them, and never wanting to turn away a dollar or a vote, it's very difficult to see how to do more of that cooperation, bridge building, and international outreach that you're mentioning, because the whole focus is on the district. There aren't very many Dons and John Delaney's and Joe Kennedy's, or certainly not very many on our side, that know about the world.
And to pile on with Francis, if you could take money out of the equation, or at least reduce it to what it maybe was 30 years ago or 50 years ago, there'd be a lot more time to travel. Right now, so many of our members will rush home on that Thursday afternoon to spend the whole weekend making money calls. Whereas I find CODELs, which is, everyone on this call knows, short for congressional delegations. Maybe at one point they were junkets, but they're not now. Everyone I've ever been on, you're working the entire time. And I'm usually exhausted when I get back home. But what a wonderful opportunity to go see the countries around the world, to meet with not just their foreign leaders, but to go do town hall meetings with your own embassy. And Aspen Institute's been doing these for years. And I've been on many of the trips. And one of my disappointments is that it tends to be the same people that come every time. I would love for many more different people have a chance to go, whether it's Prague or Bogota or Hanoi, just wherever, to get there and see how the world works.
I think you've got two organizations here, FMC and the Executive Council on Diplomacy, who wholeheartedly support that. And as you know, through FMC, their congressional study groups sponsored trips to Europe and Asia that are very valuable, and expanding the membership on the study groups is a great idea among current members of Congress.
And to our Singaporean ambassador's earlier question about how do the little countries do it? Well, I know Singapore's brought over many members of Congress and staff. When your chiefs of staff, your legislative directors get a chance to go spend a week, they come back not only enthused, but much broader perspective.
Great. So I'd like to take just a shift and look at the current environment in which we're in, all connecting virtually. We have a tendency to think about this COVID crisis in obviously the health and safety and security crisis that it is, but Congressman Beyer, you're on the Science Space Technology Committee. We've all been forced to innovate and adapt to a new technology environment that, on the one hand, has allowed us to expand our outreach, connect with many more people virtually. It is a different experience than the face-to-face meetings, which are so valuable. So I think we encourage this type of virtual discussion. Do you have any thoughts on what else we can be doing? Do you see virtual CODELs? Right now we're all together within one, US time zone network, but do you think this works? Expanding congressional members' understanding and appreciation of foreign countries if we do it globally?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I've been on a number with parliamentarians from Germany, from the Bundestag. It's so much more efficient to do this. I think most of us realizing we're getting more campaigning done this way than we were. I'm certainly spending a lot less time in the car. I just shaved for you special today, Nancy. Normally you don't have to do that. So it's not going to go back to the way it was before. And on the floor the other day, we were talking about how much more efficient hearings are and markups are doing them virtually rather than coming in person. But yeah, we will see. The world is different. The world is changing.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
When I think of all the times I've gotten on our plane, flown to Spain for a 4-hour meeting and a dinner and come back, and I'm sure you've done it a zillion times too, Nancy. There's a lot of things that shouldn't change, that can be done more efficiently. But the other side of that is, we're worried in our companies about cultural capital. It goes so long on Zoom and the aestheticism before you have to have some investments in human capital, especially one of our companies is construction, which has a whole lot of people in it. And so I don't know how that's all going to work out, but we're talking, how are we going to do enough things in person to keep the younger people, as they come into the company, acculturated to what we think, and at the same time leveraging this new technology that's quite helpful.
Indeed.
I might mention one thing, the Center for the Study of Presidency, which Tom's been very involved with, as was I, and he was head of it for a while. I think you may still be head of it. We did a deal with a bunch of Japanese legislators last week, And it was 8 o'clock my time and like, I don't know, quitting time for them. And it was about a 2-hour long discussion of challenges and opportunities between the United States and Japan. So there's opportunities to leverage Zoom with those kinds of things.
Yeah, great ideas.
At the same time, we're going to be 500,000 babies short in the US next year because of this virus. And there is something about being able to smell each other, you know, that intimacy that binds you. So it's finding a post-vaccine balance.
Exactly, exactly. So we're heading toward the final stretch here. I'd like to ask your opinion on what are the areas, the sectors, the issues that you think are most ripe for US and international collaboration going forward? Is it trade? Is it security? Is it technology? Is it climate? Putting looking into your crystal ball and looking into the future, where do you think we're best positioned and our international friends and partners are ready to be working with us as soon as we're able?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, to one degree or another, all of those are critical issues. I mean, you see Europe getting out in front of us on privacy laws, and now we're starting to make some moves that way now in the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Cicilline. And there's ways we can work together to deal with the challenges that the big technology companies present to privacy. Obviously, trade. I pushed hard for the president to go for the TPP treaty, which he wouldn't do. I think that the Pacific Alliance in South America, something I've been very involved with, offers some opportunities for us for leverage along the western coast of South America plus Mexico. And then there's the NATO business. I think NATO is very important, and woe to be negative about it, but there's probably a few structural changes that could happen. We could put a few more people in the Baltics and scattered around closer to the hot zones.
I think Francis summed it up really well. I mean, I think first priority has to be climate change, but the rest of the world is way, way ahead of us. So we just need a president that will recommit the American people to being part of the climate change solution. And I'm not despairing, because states and local governments and businesses are doing so much already. And then from my international car dealer background, the Trump trade record is mixed, but it's interesting. Ambassador Lighthizer is clearly a talent. And USMCA was a win for everybody. So we just need to, as Francis says, the TPP 11, whatever it is right now. We need to re-engage in TTIP and Europe and whatever we're going to do with the UK. But then the third thing is, we don't talk much about the nuclear arms. And this Russia versus the US thing is largely, it's not the only thing going on right now. You have China as a nuclear power, India and Pakistan, so many more developments that we have not figured out what the arms control regime looks like as we pull out of the INF, as we pull out of the open skies. There's a very complicated scenario in front of us that we're going to have to spend a lot of time on.
Yeah, you mentioned business, Don, leading. Look at the energy industry getting behind the carbon tax and climate change. The CEO of Shell has been very aggressive on that. Just last week, Mike Waltz with Chevron came out for the carbon tax. The Alliance for Market Solutions, 100 CEOs that are all for the carbon tax, and it's led by Jim Baker and George Shultz.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that we can move there really well, and there are ways to do it that where most Americans can gain. Doesn't have to be punitive.
Yeah,
and we've seen with coronavirus how quickly we can adapt.
Indeed. Closing thoughts. I'm going to go back to a variation of the first question that I asked you both, and that is, what do you wish you had known before you stepped in country as ambassador?
Well, first I would compliment the State Department on the incredibly good preparation they give in onboarding ambassadors. And I know there were some negative comments made about a couple of President Obama's appointees at hearings and things, but that's not so. If you just do what the State Department tells you, read everything they tell you, get all the briefings with the smart people like Tom Pickering and Tom Shannon and Charlie Shapiro, et cetera, you're going to know what you need to do to be an effective ambassador. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a big surprise when you show up and you've got to get off that airplane and make a speech that you've never done before about the United States. But once you do a few times, it comes along okay. Even I could do it, and that says a lot.
Congressman Beyer.
Nancy, he's way too humble, way too humble. I don't know. It says, Francis said, the State Department preparation is incredible. I think I counted 65 different meetings, at least an hour long, being debriefed on a lot of things that never came up, but at least I had that awareness and that knowledge. I think the hardest part was getting into my head, and it took a couple of months, that I was actually there as the U.S. ambassador representing my country. And the, not the burden, but the responsibility and the honor that it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're each ambassadors in our own way. I came from a political background, so for me it was a lot of traveling and relationship and getting to know the mayors and the editors, but different people would do different things based on who they were and what their interests were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Well, gentlemen, you are both terrific examples of Renaissance men, diplomats, public servants, and we thank you so much for your service, not only to your local communities, but to the nation and to the prospect of a more stable and peaceful world. The role of the diplomat is often misunderstood, often undervalued, but it is such an important framework for our peace and security going forward. I want to thank you. I want to reiterate that both FMC and the Executive Council on Diplomacy are here to support efforts to strengthen the ties between the diplomatic corps and Congress. We look for opportunities to continue to work with you, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you for having me, Nancy, from
Thank
the
you.
FMC.
One final thought, that the first former ambassador to come back and run for Congress was some guy named John Quincy Adams.
Wow, I didn't know that. Awesome.
In good company.
Yes.
Excellent. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the participants and attendees.